David couldn't believe he was finally holding the keys to his own house. After 12 years of saving every penny and working overtime at the tech company downtown, he had done it. The small two-story house on Maple Street wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it was his. The white picket fence needed a fresh coat of paint, and the front porch had a loose board that creaked when you stepped on it, but David saw potential everywhere he looked. The neighborhood seemed perfect for a guy like him. Quiet streets lined with old oak trees, kids riding bikes in the driveways, and neighbors who waved when they saw you coming home from work. The kind of place where people knew each other's names and looked out for one another. David had grown up in a cramped apartment in the city, sharing a bedroom with his two younger brothers while his mom worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Now at 34, he finally had space to breathe. The first thing David noticed about his new home was the front lawn. It stretched from the porch steps all the way to the sidewalk, a perfect rectangle of grass that had clearly been loved by the previous owner. The elderly man who sold him the house had spent 40 years tending to that lawn, and it showed. Every blade of grass seemed to stand at attention, creating a carpet so green it almost looked fake. David spent his first weekend as a homeowner at the local garden center, loading his truck with everything he thought he might need: fertilizer, a new hose, a fancy sprinkler system, and enough grass seed to replant half the neighborhood. The teenage clerk helping him load everything asked if he was starting a landscaping business. David just laughed and said he wanted to make sure his new lawn stayed as beautiful as the day he moved in. That first month flew by in a blur of unpacking boxes and learning how to be a homeowner. David discovered that owning a house meant a lot more than just having a place to sleep. The garbage disposal made weird noises. The bathroom faucet dripped constantly, and don't even get him started on trying to figure out which light switch controlled what. But every evening, after dealing with whatever new household crisis had popped up, David would grab a cold beer and sit on his front porch, looking out at his perfect lawn. He developed a routine pretty quickly. Every morning before work, he'd walk around the yard with his coffee, checking for any spots that might need attention. Weekends were for the serious lawn work, mowing in neat overlapping rows, edging along the sidewalk and driveway until every line was perfectly straight, and watering in the early evening when the sun wasn't too harsh. His neighbors probably thought he was obsessive, but David didn't care. This lawn represented everything he had worked for. The house across the street had been empty since David moved in, with a big for sale sign planted in the front yard. He kind of liked having the extra privacy, but he was also curious about who might move in. The real estate agent had mentioned it was a nice family neighborhood, and David was looking forward to having neighbors he could actually talk to instead of just waving at from a distance. 3 weeks into October, a moving truck appeared across the street. David watched from his kitchen window as the new neighbors directed movers carrying boxes and furniture into the house. He couldn't make out much detail from that distance, but he made a mental note to introduce himself once they got settled in. His mom had always taught him that being a good neighbor meant making an effort to welcome new people to the area. The new neighbor turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of confident walk that suggested she was used to being in charge. David first saw her up close when he was mowing his lawn the following Saturday. She stood in her driveway with her hands on her hips, watching him work with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. When he waved and called out a friendly hello, she just stared for a moment before turning around and walking back into her house. Over the next few days, David noticed his new neighbor seemed to spend a lot of time outside. She was always doing something in her yard, organizing her garage, or just standing around looking at the other houses on the street. Sometimes he'd catch her watching him through her front window when he was working in his garden. It wasn't necessarily unfriendly, but it wasn't exactly neighborly either. David tried not to think too much about it. Moving to a new neighborhood was stressful, and maybe she just needed time to warm up to everyone. He had been lucky with his other neighbors so far. The retired couple next door had brought him homemade cookies during his first week, and the family with 2 young kids on the other side always made sure to keep their dog from doing its business on his lawn. The woman across the street was different, though. David started noticing that she seemed to have opinions about everything that happened on their block. When the Johnsons painted their shutters a slightly different shade of blue, she spent an entire afternoon standing in their driveway having what looked like a very serious conversation with them. When old Mr. Peterson left his garbage cans out a day too long after pickup, She was over there first thing in the morning, pointing and gesturing at the cans like they were some kind of neighborhood emergency. David learned from Mrs. Chen next door that his new neighbor was named Patricia, and that she had apparently appointed herself as some kind of unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator. According to Mrs. Chen, Patricia had already been to visit every house on the block, introducing herself and asking detailed questions about property maintenance schedules and community standards. She had also mentioned something about being very involved with the homeowners association. The HOA was news to David. When he bought the house, his real estate agent had mentioned there was a neighborhood association, but made it sound like the kind of thing that organized block parties and managed the community mailboxes. Nothing too serious or invasive. David had never lived anywhere with an HOA before, but he figured as long as he kept his property looking nice and didn't cause any problems, everything would be fine. Looking back, David realized he should have paid more attention to those early warning signs. The way Patricia watched his every move, the questions Mrs. Chen said she had been asking about everyone's lawn care routines, and especially the way she seemed to be taking notes about things that seemed perfectly normal to everyone else. But David was still in the honeymoon phase of home ownership. Too excited about having his own place to worry about one neighbor who seemed a little too interested in everyone else's business. He was about to learn that some people take neighborhood watch very seriously, and that his beautiful front lawn was about to become the center of a conflict he never saw coming. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in November. David was running late for work, trying to balance his coffee mug and laptop bag while locking the front door, when he heard footsteps on his lawn. Not on the sidewalk where normal people walked, but right across his grass. He turned around to see Patricia marching straight through the middle of his yard, wearing a bright yellow jacket and carrying a clipboard like she was conducting some kind of official inspection. David stood there for a moment, not sure if he was seeing things correctly. His lawn wasn't huge, and the sidewalk ran right along the edge of his property. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to walk across his grass to get anywhere. But there was Patricia, taking long, deliberate steps right through his carefully maintained front yard, leaving footprints in the soft ground that had been dampened by the morning dew. When she reached the sidewalk on the other side, Patricia turned around and caught David staring at her. Instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, she just nodded at him like this was the most normal thing in the world, and continued walking toward the community mailboxes at the end of the street. David was so confused that he just stood there watching her go, his coffee getting cold in his hand. At first, David thought maybe it was just a one-time thing. Maybe Patricia had been distracted or in a hurry and hadn't realized she was walking on someone else's property. People made mistakes all the time, and David wasn't the type to make a big deal out of something that might have been an innocent misunderstanding. He decided to give her the benefit of the doubt and see if it happened again. It happened again the very next day. Same time, same route, same confident stride right across his front lawn. This time, David was ready for it, watching from his kitchen window as Patricia emerged from her house at exactly 7 in the morning, walked directly across the street and cut straight through his yard like it was a public walkway. She even paused in the middle of his lawn to check something on her clipboard before continuing on her way. By the end of the week, David realized this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. Patricia was deliberately using his front yard as her personal shortcut to the mailboxes. Every single morning at 7 o'clock sharp, she would cross the street and march through his grass, leaving a trail of footprints that David had to repair every weekend. The worst part was how intentional it seemed. She never hurried or acted like she was just taking the most convenient route. She walked slowly and purposefully, sometimes stopping to examine his flower beds or peer at his house like she was looking for problems. David tried to rationalize it at first. Maybe Patricia didn't understand property lines, or maybe she thought the front yard was some kind of community space. He had heard of neighborhoods where the area between the sidewalk and the street belonged to the city, but that wasn't the case here. His property line was clearly marked, and his lawn extended all the way to the public sidewalk. There was no gray area or confusion about where his land ended and public space began. The morning walks were annoying enough, but they were just the beginning. Within 2 weeks, Patricia had expanded her trespassing schedule to include afternoon visits. Around noon every day, she would emerge from her house and take another stroll across David's lawn, this time heading toward the small park at the other end of the neighborhood. She always carried the same clipboard and wore the same serious expression, like she was conducting important neighborhood business that required her to ignore basic property boundaries. David started paying closer attention to Patricia's routes, and he noticed something interesting. When she walked to other destinations that didn't require crossing his yard, she stayed on the sidewalk like a normal person. When she visited the house next to his, she walked up the driveway and used the front walkway. When she went to the corner store, she followed the sidewalk the entire way. It was only when her destination happened to be in the direction of his backyard that she suddenly developed a habit of cutting across private property. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon when David was outside planting new tulip bulbs along his front walkway. He had spent the entire morning preparing the soil and arranging the bulbs in a pattern that would create a beautiful display come spring. He was just finishing up, brushing the dirt off his hands and admiring his work, when Patricia appeared in his peripheral vision. This time she wasn't alone. She was leading a small group of people David didn't recognize, all of them carrying clipboards and notepads like they were on some kind of official tour. Patricia gestured toward David's house as she spoke, pointing out various features of his property while her companions took notes. Then, without any hesitation, she led the entire group straight across his front lawn. David couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was one thing for Patricia to trespass on his property by herself, but bringing a crowd of strangers to trample through his yard was something else entirely. The group walked right through the area where he had just planted his tulip bulbs, their heavy shoes compacting the soil and disturbing his careful arrangement. When David stood up and cleared his throat loudly, hoping to get their attention, Patricia looked over at him with an expression of mild annoyance, like he was interrupting something important. She didn't apologize or acknowledge that they were walking on his property without permission. Instead, she just nodded in his direction and continued her presentation to the group. That evening, David decided he needed to have a conversation with Patricia. He wasn't looking for a confrontation, just a polite discussion about boundaries and property respect. He had always believed that most neighborhood problems could be solved with honest communication between reasonable adults. He waited until the sun started setting, then walked across the street and knocked on Patricia's front door. Patricia answered the door quickly, like she had been expecting him. Before David could even introduce himself properly, she started talking. She explained that as the neighborhood's HOA representative, she had certain responsibilities that required her to monitor property conditions and ensure community standards were being maintained. According to Patricia, this included conducting regular inspections of all front yards and common areas. David tried to explain that while he appreciated her dedication to the neighborhood, his front yard was private property, and he would prefer that she use the sidewalk when walking past his house. He kept his tone friendly and reasonable, emphasizing that he wasn't trying to be difficult, but just wanted to protect his lawn and landscaping from unnecessary foot traffic. Patricia's response was immediate and non-negotiable. She informed David that as an HOA representative, she had the authority to access any property in the neighborhood for inspection purposes. She claimed this authority was outlined in the neighborhood covenants that every homeowner had agreed to when they purchased their property. When David mentioned that he had never seen any documentation giving HOA representatives the right to trespass on private property, Patricia suggested he should familiarize himself with the community rules and regulations. The conversation went downhill from there. Every point David tried to make about property rights and common courtesy was met with Patricia's insistence that neighborhood oversight took precedence over individual preferences. She made it clear that she had no intention of changing her routine, and seemed genuinely puzzled by David's objection to her presence on his lawn. As David walked back to his house that evening, he realized he was dealing with someone who had fundamentally different ideas about boundaries and respect. Patricia wasn't accidentally trespassing or misunderstanding the situation. She genuinely believed she had the right to walk wherever she wanted in the neighborhood, and no amount of polite conversation was going to change her mind. The next morning, Patricia was back on schedule, marching across David's lawn at exactly 7 o'clock. But this time she made a point of walking even more slowly than usual, stopping to examine his grass and flower beds with exaggerated attention. It felt like a message, a way of letting David know that their conversation the night before hadn't changed anything except maybe making her more determined to assert whatever authority she thought she had. David stood at his kitchen window, watching Patricia's leisurely tour of his front yard, and realized that his quiet suburban dream was about to become a lot more complicated. David tried everything he could think of to solve the problem peacefully. After his unsuccessful conversation with Patricia, he spent hours researching the neighborhood's HOA documents online, looking for any mention of inspection rights or property access rules. What he found surprised him. The Homeowners Association was basically a paper organization that managed the community mailboxes and organized an annual block party. There was absolutely nothing in the official documents about representatives having the right to walk on private property for any reason. Armed with this information, David decided to try a different approach. He printed out copies of the relevant sections of the HOA bylaws and walked back over to Patricia's house the following evening. This time he came prepared with documentation and a calm, factual presentation about property boundaries and association authority. He figured that once Patricia saw the actual rules in black and white, she would realize she had been mistaken about her inspection rights. Patricia listened to David's explanation with the kind of patience people use when dealing with someone they consider hopelessly confused. When he finished showing her the bylaws and pointing out that nowhere did it mention trespassing rights, she just smiled and shook her head. According to Patricia, the written documents only covered the basic framework of the association. The real authority, she explained, came from years of tradition and unwritten understanding between neighbors who cared about maintaining community standards. She went on to tell David that the previous homeowner had never objected to her inspections, and that most long-term residents understood the importance of allowing designated community representatives to monitor property conditions. Patricia suggested that David's resistance to these established practices showed he might not be the right fit for their close-knit neighborhood community. The conversation ended with Patricia informing David that she would be conducting more frequent inspections of his property due to what she called his concerning attitude toward community cooperation. True to her word, Patricia increased her trespassing schedule from twice a day to 3 times a day. Morning, noon, and evening, she would find reasons to walk across David's lawn, always carrying her clipboard and always taking her time to examine everything from his grass height to his flower bed maintenance. David realized that trying to reason with Patricia was pointless, so he decided to take his concerns to the official HOA board. He spent a week tracking down contact information for the actual board members, which turned out to be more difficult than he expected. The association was so informal that most residents didn't even know who was officially in charge beyond seeing Patricia walking around with her clipboard. When David finally managed to reach the HOA president, an elderly man named Robert who lived 3 streets over, he discovered something disturbing. Robert had never appointed Patricia as an inspection representative, and he had no idea she was telling people she had official authority to access private property. According to Robert, Patricia had volunteered to help with some community communication tasks earlier in the year, but she had never been given any kind of enforcement or inspection role. The HOA president promised to have a conversation with Patricia about overstepping her authority, but he also mentioned that the association preferred to let neighbors work out minor disputes among themselves rather than getting involved in what he called personality conflicts. David got the impression that Robert viewed the whole situation as a minor misunderstanding that would eventually resolve itself if everyone just tried to get along. Unfortunately, Robert's conversation with Patricia only made things worse. Instead of backing down, Patricia seemed to interpret the HOA president's involvement as confirmation that David was a troublemaker who couldn't follow basic community guidelines. Her daily trespassing became more aggressive and deliberate. She started bringing measuring tapes and cameras, documenting what she claimed were various property violations that needed to be reported to city authorities. One afternoon, David came home from work to find Patricia in his backyard, taking photos of his fence and making notes about what she called unpermitted modifications. When David asked her to leave his property immediately, Patricia informed him that property line disputes required official documentation, and she was simply gathering evidence to present to the appropriate authorities. She claimed David's fence was 2 inches closer to the property line than city regulations allowed, and that his sprinkler system was creating drainage issues that affected the entire neighborhood. David had checked all the permits and regulations when he bought the house, and he knew his fence and sprinkler system were completely legal and properly installed. But Patricia's accusations worried him anyway. Even false complaints could create bureaucratic headaches and potentially expensive legal problems. He started to understand that Patricia wasn't just trespassing for the sake of asserting authority. She was building some kind of case against him, documenting everything she could find that might be turned into an official violation. The situation escalated further when Patricia started bringing other people on her inspection tours of David's property. Sometimes it was neighbors from other streets who Patricia claimed needed to see examples of problematic property maintenance. Other times it was people David didn't recognize at all, who Patricia introduced as concerned community members or fellow HOA representatives. These groups would spend 10 or 15 minutes walking around David's yard, taking photos and having serious discussions about various aspects of his landscaping and home maintenance. David started documenting everything himself, taking photos and videos of Patricia's trespassing incidents, and keeping a detailed log of every time she and her companions walked on his property without permission. He thought this evidence might be useful if he eventually needed to file a formal complaint or get law enforcement involved. What he captured on camera was even worse than he had realized. The video showed Patricia deliberately stepping on his flower beds, leaving gates open that were supposed to keep his dog contained, and even picking flowers from his garden to show to her companions. In one particularly infuriating incident, David's security camera caught Patricia testing his outdoor faucet and complaining to her group that it created too much water pressure, which she claimed was evidence of illegal plumbing modifications. The breaking point came on a weekend in early December, when David was hosting his parents for their first visit to his new house. He had spent weeks preparing for their arrival, making sure every detail of his home and yard was perfect. His parents had sacrificed a lot to help him achieve his dream of home ownership, and David wanted them to see how well their investment in his education and career had paid off. David's parents arrived on Saturday morning, and he was giving them a tour of his property when Patricia appeared with the largest group yet. At least 6 people followed her across the street and onto David's lawn, where they began what looked like an official inspection of his property. Patricia was explaining something about setback requirements and drainage regulations, while her companions took measurements and photos. David's father, a retired construction worker who had spent 40 years dealing with building codes and property regulations, watched the scene with growing confusion. He asked David who these people were and what authority they had to be measuring and photographing private property. When David explained the situation, his father's confusion turned to anger. David's parents had grown up in an era where people respected each other's property and privacy. The idea that a neighbor could simply decide to treat someone else's yard like public property was completely foreign to them. David's mother suggested calling the police immediately, while his father wanted to march over and demand that Patricia explain herself. David realized that the situation had gone far beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. Patricia's behavior was affecting his ability to enjoy his own home and was creating stress that extended to his family relationships. The harassment had transformed his dream house into a source of constant anxiety and frustration. Every time he looked out his window, he wondered when Patricia would appear next and what new violation she would claim to have discovered. That evening, after his parents had gone to bed, David sat on his front porch and tried to figure out what to do next. He had tried diplomacy, documentation, and official channels, but nothing had worked. Patricia seemed determined to continue her harassment campaign, regardless of property rights, HOA authority, or basic neighborly respect. David realized that he was dealing with someone who had decided to make his life difficult, and who wasn't going to stop until someone or something forced her to change her behavior. Looking across the street at Patricia's house, where lights were still on and he could see her silhouette moving around inside, David knew that this conflict was far from over. If anything, it was just getting started. Patricia had made it clear that she considered his resistance to her authority as a challenge that needed to be met with even more aggressive enforcement of her self-appointed role as neighborhood overseer. David went inside and started researching his legal options, determined to find a way to protect his property and his peace of mind without escalating the situation into something that would affect the entire neighborhood. But deep down, He was starting to realize that some problems couldn't be solved with patience and good intentions. After weeks of dealing with Patricia's escalating harassment, David knew he needed professional advice. He reached out to his college friend Jake, who had become a property lawyer after graduation. David explained the situation over lunch, showing Jake the videos he had collected and the documentation of Patricia's repeated trespassing incidents. He expected Jake to suggest filing a restraining order or pursuing criminal charges for harassment. Instead, Jake surprised him with a different perspective. While Patricia's behavior was clearly wrong and probably illegal, pursuing legal action would likely take months or even years to resolve. In the meantime, Patricia would probably continue her harassment campaign, and David would be stuck dealing with court dates, legal fees, and the stress of an ongoing lawsuit. Jake suggested that David might want to consider a more creative solution that would solve the problem immediately and permanently. Jake explained that property owners had the legal right to protect their land from trespassing and damage, as long as they used reasonable methods that didn't pose a danger to others. This included installing barriers, fencing, and even defensive landscaping features designed to discourage unwanted foot traffic. The key was making sure any protective measures were clearly visible, properly marked, and served a legitimate property maintenance purpose. This got David thinking about legal ways to make his lawn less appealing as a shortcut for Patricia and her inspection tours. He started researching property protection methods and discovered that many homeowners use decorative barriers to protect delicate landscaping from foot traffic. These range from simple rope barriers and decorative fencing to more sophisticated solutions like garden spikes and protective ground covers. David spent the next week visiting garden centers and home improvement stores, learning about different options for protecting his lawn and flower beds. He talked to landscaping professionals about legitimate ways to prevent foot traffic damage, explaining that he had a problem with people cutting across his yard and disrupting his carefully maintained grass and plants. Every expert he consulted agreed that protective barriers were not only legal but recommended for any homeowner serious about maintaining quality landscaping. The solution David settled on was both elegant and effective. He would install a series of decorative metal garden spikes designed specifically to protect sensitive grass and flower areas from foot traffic. These spikes were commonly used by professional landscapers and were available at any major garden center. They were tall enough to be clearly visible, sharp enough to discourage walking, and specifically designed for the purpose of protecting valuable landscaping investments. David researched the local regulations carefully before making any purchases. He discovered that property owners had the right to install protective landscaping features on their own land as long as they were properly marked and served a legitimate purpose. The spikes he was considering were classified as garden accessories rather than security devices, which meant they were subject to much less restrictive regulations than other types of barriers. To make sure he was completely within his rights, David contacted the city planning office and spoke with a representative about landscaping protection methods. The city official confirmed that decorative garden spikes were perfectly legal for property protection purposes, especially when combined with appropriate warning signs and clear property markers. The official even mentioned that several other homeowners in the area had installed similar features to protect expensive landscaping from foot traffic damage. David also checked with his homeowner's insurance company to make sure the protective spikes wouldn't affect his coverage or create any liability issues. The insurance representative explained that property owners were generally protected from liability when people were injured while trespassing, especially when the property was clearly marked and the protective features were visible and reasonable. As long as David installed proper warning signs and used commercially available garden products, he would be covered under his existing policy. With all the legal and practical details sorted out, David began planning his installation strategy. He wanted the protective spikes to be effective without being excessive or dangerous. The goal was to make walking across his lawn uncomfortable and inconvenient, not to cause serious injury to anyone who might accidentally step on his property. David measured his front yard carefully and calculated exactly how many spikes he would need to cover the areas where Patricia typically walked. The spikes David chose were 6 inches tall with pointed tops, made from powder-coated steel that would resist weather damage. They were designed to be pushed into the ground about 4 inches deep, leaving 2 inches visible above the grass level. Each spike was painted bright yellow for maximum visibility and came with small reflective strips that would make them easy to see even in low-light conditions. The manufacturer specifically marketed them as humane wildlife and foot traffic deterrents for protecting valuable landscaping. David also purchased a set of small, professional-looking signs that read "Protected Landscaping Area. Please use sidewalk and private property. No trespassing." These signs were designed to complement the garden spikes and provide clear warning to anyone who might be tempted to walk across the protected areas. The signs were made from weather-resistant materials and included mounting stakes that could be easily installed anywhere on his property. The weekend David chose for installation was deliberately picked to coincide with Patricia's busiest inspection schedule. He had noticed that she typically spent Saturday mornings conducting tours for her various groups of concerned citizens and community representatives. David wanted to make sure the protective spikes were clearly visible and properly marked before Patricia's next scheduled trespassing incident. David started early Saturday morning, carefully measuring and marking the locations where each spike would be installed. He focused on the areas where Patricia typically walked, creating a protective barrier that would make her usual route across his lawn impossible without navigating around clearly marked obstacles. The installation process was straightforward but time-consuming, requiring David to ensure each spike was properly seated and visible. As he worked, David noticed several neighbors watching his activities with interest. Mrs. Chen from next door came over to ask about the garden spikes, and David explained that he was installing protection for his landscaping to prevent foot traffic damage. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly and mentioned that she had been considering similar measures for her own flower beds, which had been suffering from what she diplomatically called increased pedestrian activity in recent months. By noon, David had installed 43 protective spikes across his front lawn, creating a clearly marked barrier that would make cutting across his property both uncomfortable and obviously inappropriate. Each spike was accompanied by appropriate warning signage, and the entire installation looked professional and purposeful rather than aggressive or threatening. David took photos of the completed installation to document that all protective measures were clearly visible and properly marked. The final step was testing the visibility and effectiveness of the installation. David walked around his property from every angle, making sure the spikes were obvious to anyone approaching from any direction. He also walked the normal sidewalk route that Patricia should have been using all along, confirming that there was absolutely no reason for anyone to walk across his protected landscaping areas unless they were deliberately choosing to trespass. As David finished his installation and cleaned up his tools, he felt a sense of satisfaction and relief that had been missing for months. For the first time since Patricia had started her harassment campaign, David felt like he had some control over his own property. The protective spikes were a reasonable, legal, and effective solution that would finally force Patricia to respect his property boundaries without requiring him to engage in confrontations or legal battles. David spent the rest of Saturday enjoying his newly protected lawn, confident that Monday morning would bring the first test of his defensive landscaping strategy. He had no intention of hurting anyone, but he was determined to make sure his property was finally treated with the respect it deserved. Patricia had made it clear that she wouldn't respond to polite requests or official authority, but David was betting she would respond to the reality of clearly marked property protection. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made everything seem sharper and more defined. David stood at his kitchen window with his coffee, watching Patricia's house across the street and wondering how she would react to his newly protected landscape. He didn't have to wait long to find out. At exactly 7 o'clock, Patricia emerged from her front door carrying her usual clipboard and wearing her bright yellow inspection jacket. She paused on her front steps, looking across the street at David's yard with what appeared to be confusion. Even from that distance, the yellow garden spikes were clearly visible, creating an obvious barrier across the areas where she typically walked. Patricia crossed the street slowly, stopping at the edge of David's property to examine the protective installation more closely. David watched as she read the warning signs and studied the garden spikes, clearly trying to figure out how to proceed with her usual trespassing routine. For a moment, it looked like she might actually use the sidewalk like a normal person. Instead, Patricia pulled out her phone and made what appeared to be an angry phone call. David couldn't hear what she was saying, but her body language suggested she was complaining to someone about his property protection measures. The call lasted several minutes, during which Patricia gestured emphatically at David's yard and pointed at various aspects of the spike installation. When Patricia finished her phone call, she walked along the sidewalk until she reached the corner of David's property, then stepped carefully onto his lawn between two of the protective spikes. David realized she was trying to find a path through his defensive landscaping that would still allow her to cut across his yard. Patricia moved slowly and deliberately, testing each step to avoid the clearly marked obstacles. What happened next was both inevitable and completely preventable. Patricia was so focused on navigating around the garden spikes that she failed to notice she was walking directly toward a cluster of 3 spikes that protected David's prized rose bushes. She was talking on her phone again, apparently updating someone on her progress through what she probably considered David's unreasonable obstacle course. The spike that caught Patricia's foot was painted bright yellow, clearly visible and surrounded by warning signs. She stepped directly onto it while looking at her clipboard, and the pointed metal tip went straight through the thin sole of her designer walking shoe. Patricia's scream of surprise and pain could probably be heard 3 blocks away. David watched from his window as Patricia hopped around on one foot, pulling her injured shoe off and examining the small puncture wound on her foot. She was clearly more shocked than seriously hurt, but her reaction was immediate and explosive. Patricia began shouting about booby traps and assault, demanding that David come outside to face the consequences of what she called his malicious property modifications. The commotion brought neighbors out of their houses from all directions. David stepped onto his front porch to assess the situation, where he was immediately confronted by Patricia's angry demands that he remove his illegal barriers and pay for her medical expenses. According to Patricia, David had deliberately set a trap designed to injure innocent people who were simply trying to conduct legitimate neighborhood business. David remained calm and pointed out that Patricia had been repeatedly asked to stop trespassing on his property, that the protective spikes were clearly visible and properly marked, and that she had deliberately chosen to walk on his lawn despite obvious warnings and barriers. He also mentioned that his security cameras had recorded the entire incident, showing Patricia clearly seeing the spikes and warning signs before choosing to trespass anyway. The first police officer arrived within 10 minutes, followed shortly by 2 more patrol cars and an ambulance that someone had called as a precaution. David had all of his documentation ready, including the videos of Patricia's previous trespassing incidents, the legal research he had done before installing the protective spikes, and receipts showing that everything he had installed was commercially available garden equipment designed specifically for landscaping protection. Officer Martinez, the senior patrol officer on the scene, examined the spike installation carefully and questioned both David and Patricia about the history of their dispute. Patricia demanded that David be arrested for creating a dangerous booby trap, while David explained that he had installed legitimate property protection measures after months of unsuccessful attempts to stop Patricia's trespassing through normal channels. The officer's investigation was thorough and professional. He measured the height and spacing of the garden spikes, photographed the warning signs, and verified that all protective measures were clearly visible from any approach angle. Officer Martinez also reviewed David's security camera footage, which clearly showed Patricia reading the warning signs and deliberately stepping around several spikes before eventually stepping on one while distracted by her phone conversation. Patricia's demands for David's arrest became increasingly desperate as Officer Martinez explained the legal realities of the situation. Property owners had the right to install reasonable protective measures on their own land, especially when dealing with repeated trespassing incidents. The garden spikes were commercially available products designed specifically for landscaping protection. They were clearly marked and visible, and Patricia had been repeatedly warned to stop trespassing before David installed them. The officer also pointed out that Patricia had admitted to conducting regular inspections of David's property without his permission, which constituted criminal trespassing, regardless of any claimed HOA authority. When Patricia produced her clipboard and claimed she had official inspection rights, Officer Martinez asked to see her credentials and legal documentation. Of course, Patricia had no official authority whatsoever, just her own assumption that carrying a clipboard gave her the right to ignore property boundaries. The paramedics who examined Patricia's foot confirmed that her injury was minor, requiring nothing more than a bandage and a tetanus shot. The puncture wound was shallow and clean, with no signs of serious damage or infection risk. Patricia's dramatic claims about assault and battery were undermined by the medical assessment that her injury was equivalent to stepping on a nail or thumbtack. As the police completed their investigation, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered to watch the proceedings. David was surprised to discover how many of them had their own stories about Patricia's inappropriate behavior and harassment tactics. Mrs. Chen mentioned that Patricia had been taking measurements in her backyard without permission. The elderly couple from down the street described several incidents where Patricia had demanded access to their garage to inspect for code violations. Officer Martinez spent nearly an hour documenting the incident and taking statements from multiple witnesses. His final report noted that David had taken reasonable and legal steps to protect his property from repeated trespassing, that Patricia had been clearly warned about both the trespassing and the protective measures, and that her injury was the direct result of her own decision to ignore obvious warnings and continue trespassing on private property. The best part of the entire incident was Patricia's conversation with the real HOA president, Robert, who arrived on the scene after someone called him about the police activity. Robert publicly confirmed that Patricia had no official authority to inspect anyone's property and that the HOA had never authorized her to trespass on private land. He also mentioned that several neighbors had complained about Patricia's harassment tactics and that the association was considering formal action to distance itself from her unauthorized activities. By the time the police finished their investigation and the ambulance departed, Patricia's entire facade of official authority had been completely dismantled. Her claims about HOA inspection rights had been debunked by the actual HOA president. Her demands for David's arrest had been rejected by law enforcement, and her dramatic injury had been revealed as a minor puncture wound caused by her own deliberate trespassing. The aftermath of the incident was swift and satisfying. Patricia never again set foot on David's property, apparently having learned that protective landscaping spikes were both legal and effective. Her morning inspection tours ended abruptly, and her afternoon property surveys became a thing of the past. The other neighbors who had been quietly suffering from Patricia's harassment felt empowered to establish their own boundaries and refuse her unauthorized inspections. David's front lawn remained pristine and undisturbed, protected by his clearly marked garden spikes and the powerful deterrent effect of Patricia's very public humiliation. The security cameras that had documented months of trespassing incidents now recorded nothing more interesting than the occasional delivery truck and morning joggers who stayed safely on the sidewalk where they belonged. Within a month, Patricia had put her house up for sale and moved to a different neighborhood, presumably in search of residents who would be more tolerant of her self-appointed enforcement activities. David never learned whether she found what she was looking for, but he was perfectly happy to let that become someone else's problem. The garden spikes remained in place through the winter and into the following spring, when David finally removed them after confirming that Patricia was gone for good. His tulip bulbs bloomed beautifully that year, undisturbed by unauthorized foot traffic and thriving in soil that had been protected from compaction and damage. David's dream of peaceful suburban homeownership had finally become a reality, secured by a few strategically placed garden accessories, and the simple principle that property rights still meant something in America.